Before I begin, I would also like to, of course, thank CPA Ontario for sponsoring the Centre for Sustainability and Performance Management. They are our sponsor, but all of the discussions and opinions that we present today will be those of Claudine or myself. They're not those of our sponsoring organizations. So Claudine, you are the RBC Professor in Responsible Organizations at the Molson School of Business at Concordia University. And I have to note that you were recently awarded the 2024 Cher Genre, the chair of the Institut du Genre of the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, the very globally known CNRS of France. And that chair was created to promote research and research collaborations on gender inequalities. So that was announced last week, I believe. So félicitations, congratulations. That's a great honor. And duly deserved for the work that you're doing in this area. So for the academics on the call, we know Claudine as a widely published scholar on a number of topics. And for the predominantly practitioner-oriented guests on the call today, I would just like to mention that Claudine has some really interesting, accessible, non-academic, but based upon academic writings available through her articles on The Conversation and through other outlets. And we're going to put her a link to her homepage in the chat. And in particular, I think you'd probably be looking for the links under essays for press or videos for some interesting work that she has done in this area. And so today, the topic the project of yours, Claudine, that we're going to be discussing was called Disruptive Dames, for which you've been provided a Social Sciences and Humanities Research of Canada grant. You also have related work related to addressing topics such as burnout, workplace culture that can be impediments to male colleagues taking paternity leave and so forth. But today we're going to be talking about your Disruptive Dames project. This is not a typical stream of research, I would say, for an accounting academic. So could you tell us how you got into this? What are the research questions that you're investigating? And give us a start of an overview of what you found in your work.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you and CPA for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here and share what I know about gender inequalities with you and our audience. So it's really great to be here. Thank you very much. So what got me into this area of research is really also a personal experience. As I went and got my job and started working, I realized that gender inequalities are far from being solved. And that oftentimes as women, we face higher hurdles than men in the workplace to advance. And I grew up with a grandmother who was driving the car. It wasn't my grandfather, and my mom, she worked. And, I sort of thought that these issues were solved. And I came to realize that's not the case. So it's really a personal experience that brought me into this. And so I started about 10 years ago getting into the topic of gender inequalities. And I felt like I had to get a whole second PhD because it's extremely broad. So then I also started to apply for funding, and I got this SHIRK funding, which SHIRK is a big Canadian government funding project. And so that was extremely helpful in getting me started. And so what we're talking about today comes out of that first funding support that I received. And so what I did with that funding is I went out and interviewed women leaders across Canada about their experience of working in leadership, but also rising through the ranks and making it into leadership. And I found that was very eye-opening, including in light of what we already know from the literature. And so this project that we'll talk about today speaks to one aspect of their experiences. So there's a lot of other things that they spoke about, but I think this is something very crucial because it speaks about something very mundane, being labeled and being assigned labels. So I think it's important to have this in mind, that what seems like no big deal, a label, actually can be very important because it has repercussions, not just for us, but also for others. Okay, so
Can you explain to us what that means about being assigned a label within an organization?
Sure, sure. So I'll start with a very simple label that, if you have caregiving obligations, and oftentimes for many women that means having children, I think we're all familiar with the term mommy track. We've at least heard it. And it means that once you have kids, and even in anticipation of having kids, so you might not yet have kids, but for whatever reason, just maybe because of your body parts, people think you might have children, you're being assigned different work, less ambitious work, less challenging work, work that is going to make it less likely that you're going to be considered a candidate for promotion, especially into higher level roles. And so you're sort of getting onto that sidetrack. And so the label that is assigned with that is essentially the mommy label or the caretaker label. And what it does is that it sort of imprisons you in your gender that people assign to you. And so from the psychology literature, we know that it's when you meet somebody. So let's say you're in an elevator and a person walks in, you will assign a gender to them instantaneously, and it's not something you're aware of. And so that gender assignment is usually binary assignments. So it's either going to be a man or a woman for you. And with that assignment comes expectations for how they behave and what they do. And these expectations are based on what you learn and observe throughout your life. So if you're growing up in a community where most women take care of children, you see a woman, you assign the gender of woman to that person, you will expect that this person does certain things, and you will sort of naturalize that and say, well, it's normal, she's a woman. And the same thing is true for men, except that you will have different expectations because you see men doing other things, right? And so when you're in a corporate setting where people get put on a mommy track, well, that has to do with this expectation that because they're women and they look like women, they should act in a certain way, even though that woman in particular that you're looking at or dealing with might have no interest in having children, might be very well able to have kids and be fully invested in her career. But there is this sort of preconceived notion, this bias, that she's going to behave in a certain way. And it's in a way self-perpetuating because women oftentimes will anticipate this. And oftentimes what we see is also that women then self-select into particular jobs because they know it's expected of them to do certain things. And there's penalties in society when you don't conform to these expectations. In your family, you might be entitled to certain comments, or from peers, there might be pressure to do things in a certain way. And when I say peers here, I'm talking about friends. So these are people in your life. They expect you to work in certain ways and do things in certain ways, also because it confirms their own life choices.
And so for women,
go ahead.
So for women, what are some of these labels that we should be, even whether we have children or not, the expectation is that we should be somehow softer, more nurturing,
yes, exactly.
less vocal.
Yeah.
And what are the and once those implicit labels, not necessarily ever spoken, but the implicit bias that people have for those being our expected norms, what happens when we violate those?
Yes.
If we're not, nurturing is not our nature, whether we have children or not. When we're at work, exactly. We might not want to be nurturing. We might want to be vocal leaders.
That's a very good question. So let's continue with the label of mom, and this will actually oftentimes be an explicit label. So because you mentioned oftentimes labels are implicit, and that's true, but oftentimes they're also implicit. So I remember interviewing a woman who was looking for a new job, and she was going through the interview process to be recruited for new jobs. And she was extremely aware of how, and worried about how there would be this conversation in background that she wasn't privy to about her having children. And she told me if she'd be a man, they wouldn't be having this conversation because the assumption would be that it would be the wife or the partner or the female one in the couple who would be taking care of any potential child. So she was very much aware of this, that it would be working against her. So this is related to what you point out. There's these roles that are assigned to us depending on our gender. So if we look like a woman, it will be expected of us that we behave in particular ways, that we take care of others' needs. So we're sort of oriented towards others, and we are concerned with their well-being, ahead of our well-being. We're being nice, we show empathy for them, we're being kind. Okay, so we're sort of put in a cast, if you want, and if we deviate from that, there are going to be penalties. And a very good example is another label. So when you think of a woman who's assertive, in a man, this is equality. A guy who's assertive, this is usually seen as somebody who is going to be strong and decisive. Now, if you're a woman and you're being assertive in a workplace, this will often be held against you. And I've had women leaders tell me that there is a very concrete label with that. It ends with itch and it starts with a B, you know. And so it's an extremely devalorizing label. If you're given this label, it makes you feel very uncomfortable. It puts you down in front of whoever is present. And if you're already in some sort of leadership role, it takes away your authority. So it's really a terrible position to put somebody in. And the only reason you're doing that is because you're uncomfortable with a woman being assertive. So she's not actually the problem. The problem is whoever is sort of giving out that label and calling her that word. So that's the person who has a problem with it. And that person uses that label to put her down.
And so what are the adaptive mechanisms that you observe, that researchers observe? How do women in particular respond to these various labels that are assigned to them?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very hard for them because they have to put a lot of time and energy into solving problems that men don't have to deal with. You know, if you're being assertive as a guy, nobody's going to call you that word. So a lot of women, what they do is they really try hard to anticipate the problem, because that's the reality of the world they live in, that, well, guys are not, so that's part of the problem, is that guys, they're not supposed to, or men are not supposed to necessarily show empathy for others. They don't need to be in this caregiving mode. So that's part of the problem. And I think it's an important part of the problem that is oftentimes overseen, that leadership is essentially a very masculine still phenomenon. And so it's associated with men. It's associated with being assertive, with taking initiative, and all of those are still not seen as female qualities. So we have this very masculine type leadership and ideas around leadership, and we have very feminine type ideas around care work. And so women, they are very careful and try to bring in a lot of, you know, empathy into how they do leadership, precisely to avoid the B label, you know. But sometimes as a leader, you have to be assertive. So it puts them really between a rock and a hard place, because you have to manage this sort of impossible dance where you're being kind and tough, and it's really difficult. And I think an oftentimes overseen solution is that we also open the whole notion of how we think about leadership and make it more inclusive. So the problem isn't women. The problem is that we think of leadership in very particular ways that exclude oftentimes the ways in which women behave.
And so can you tell us about, so you've conducted quite a few interviews with, as you said, female executives around Canada. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Did you target firms where it looked like women were not succeeding to identify problem cases of organizations, for example? Or did you target firms that had women as leaders? And in either case, how pervasive are the challenges that women leaders are facing in organizations?
So in that first big research project that I did, I looked at not particular kinds of firms, but I reached out for women who had recently been appointed to their first board position. So that was really the starting point. And the idea was to speak with people who have still a good understanding and memory of how that whole process unfolded over time. And so a lot of these women spoke about how they're really in the minority on their boards, in the sense that the majority of people on the boards are men, and even more so in the C-suite. I think many of us are probably familiar with that very sad statistic that there's more CEOs in Canada called Steve or Mark than women CEOs. So whatever gender inequalities you have in terms of boards of directors, you'll have more in the C-suite. And part of the problem there are the ways in which roles are defined. So oftentimes roles are defined in the C-suite, not in terms of what are the qualities that we really need in the long term, but more what have we always had in place, and we need to have the same thing, which may or may not be reflective of the skills that you need going forward. And so that's something that oftentimes comes up in interviews that I do, including with C-suite women. Because now I'm on a second study where I look at companies that seem to have solved the problem of not having a lot of women in their leadership. But it turns out that oftentimes that's more of an illusion in terms of gender inequalities, because they might appoint women to their leadership, but they still have a lot of processes in place that whereby women are delegitimized. So, for instance, oftentimes when there's meetings, well, women are spoken over. So somebody will just interrupt a woman and not let her speak, or not give women proper credit for whatever they had to say, or have very disruptive behavior when a woman speaks up, like become very angry, and so not also not respect their authority. So you can have companies that look on paper as if they've solved their gender inequality problems, but then if you dig deeper, there are still a lot of issues. And so this is ongoing work. I continue doing interviews with women in Canadian leadership positions.
And so just looking at the numbers is not going to tell us the story as to whether or not the problems remain. So one of the things that...
If I can add something, Alicia, I think something also be aware of is that firms can be very strategic with numbers. They can appoint women into leadership positions just to look good. And they can do what is called in research showcasing women. So they will appoint 2 or 3 women and declare problem solved. And whenever there is an EDI event where they need to look good, they'll take out their women and put them in front of the camera and have a whole spiel around, look at us, we're so great. But if you remove that very shiny cover and look underneath, it doesn't look that great. So this is sort of like an unintended consequences of having this sort of disclosures where firms need to count bodies. I mean, that's because it's a cultural problem. It's not a body problem. It's a cultural problem in the end.
Understood. And so one of the things that I found disheartening, saddening, disappointed to learn was that these things were still very pervasive. I certainly thought that my predecessors several decades ago had solved all of these problems, or at least that my own generation had solved it or contributed to the solution for those behind us. It's easy for some of us who experience what you've described, and I absolutely 100% have, including notably in Canada, where I thought things were different. We have a prime minister who's a self-declared feminist and so forth, and but that doesn't mean that all of our organizations are as progressive as we would like to believe. So on the one positive in the worst way that I took from that is at least I'm not alone. It's way more pervasive than I thought. But that's also, again, extremely disheartening, both for those of us who are still, who are senior and still active in the game, but especially for those who are coming behind us. We haven't righted this ship in a way that will be as welcoming as it needs to be today or going forward. So what can we do, those of us who are senior, relatively senior women, others who are behind us coming up, and what can our male allies, would-be allies, also do to address this problem and create a more egalitarian world?
That's a very good question. I'm afraid there are no easy answers. I'm just going to say that right away. But I'm going to backtrack a bit to sort of explain my answer in a longer way and be more concrete in how I answer. So you mentioned that, when you started out, you had hoped that by now we'd have solved these issues. And I think that's sort of a very fair hope. And a lot of things have been done. So the World Bank has an index that looks at the law across different countries and how it treats men and women in different areas of life. So, for instance, it looks at, safety, it looks at leaves, parental, maternity, paternity leaves. It looks at pay, all kinds of things. And so countries, they get assigned scores that maximum of score is 100. If you have a score of 100, it means, well, at least from a legal perspective, men and women have the same standing. And Canada has a score of 100. The US, by the way, doesn't. They have a score of 93 or 92, okay? So when it comes to law, those problems have been solved. But law, in a way, is also the easy problems, because you have a text and you see there's a problem in the text and it can be changed. So in a way, it's the low-hanging fruit. Now, I think where a lot of the problems that we're still seeing come from are not these, these hard laws that are in books, but in what I call soft laws, and that's social norms, And changing social norms means everybody has to be on board and has to agree that we need to think differently about things. And I think a very good example is how we think about still care work, and be that care work for young children, elderly family members, it doesn't matter. Women are still largely seen as those taking on this kind of care work. And I've done a study here in France, I'm currently in France, on men taking paternity leaves. And so France does have, like many places in Canada, provisions for men to take paternity leaves. And very often men are extremely reluctant to take these leaves because they know there's a penalty for taking leaves. And so the men we spoke with were men working in accountancy firms. And the firms themselves, they were promoting maternity leaves inside their company a lot more than paternity leaves. So paternity leaves were on the book, men were legally entitled to them, but the firms didn't promote them, and men were extremely reluctant to take them because they knew that for them, the penalty in terms of careers were actually higher than for women. So they were extremely concerned. And so what does this mean? So, well, somebody has to look after the kids. So then it's the woman who takes the leaves. And that just means the social norms of who does the care work will not change. Because we're always growing up, like the next generation will grow up seeing women do most of that work. For them, it will be normal that women do care work, men do not do care work. Leadership will be mostly occupied by men because women have to, by the time they're 30, 40, 50, 60, they will have spent less time or less intensive time in the workforce because of that care work. And, it just increases the hurdles they face. So in order to change things, we need to think about those social norms and think about ways in which we can crack open the norms around care work, around leadership. And so make leadership more inclusive. So it would be extremely important in organizations to have men leaders talk about care work they do and showcase care work, to normalize men doing care work. I think women have been leaning in a lot. I don't think you can lean in anymore. And I think, therefore, it's very important that we talk about this other aspect of this equation, which is men and care work. And that's something that we often don't talk about. And one of the issues is that when we talk about gender inequalities, it's oftentimes seen as a women's issue. But gender includes both men and women. And so it's important that we also talk about men and talk about how men come in there. And the men we spoke with oftentimes were actually frustrated with not being able to be more hands-on and take the paternity leaves and have more time off. So it's not that men aren't interested, it's that they live in a society that expects them to not be interested and makes it easier for them to not be interested. So when it comes to changing that, we need to work on that.
Excellent. These are great insights. And we have some interesting comments also in the chat that I would like to share. Jamie says, I completely agree with this perspective. Also important is a study on seditious sirs, men who show more empathy and support and are penalized for being weak. So I was thinking that when you were talking about, I'm not familiar with that research, but that being said, I'm not surprised. Some of us women are less, or appear to be less, nurturing and thus violate that gender role, but there are also men who tend to be more empathetic, and they're violating an assigned label that we have for them in our our society as well. And so it's definitely a dual problem.
And if I can pick up on that, Liz, I think like what you're pointing out there and what a member in the audience pointed out, I think that is so important. And I have an 8-year-old girl. She goes to primary school. And so it starts at school, you know, even before that. I remember when I was going buying clothing for her in a clothing store, the first question I would be asked is is it a boy or a girl? Like at the age of 2, it doesn't matter, you know, it's irrelevant. And once they're in school, you know, there's that famous expression, throwing like a girl. That's one of the worst things a boy can hear. So you're using something that is associated with women and being female as a derogatory term. That's a problem. Like, people need to stop saying that, you know.
And so we have another comment here from Julie, who has found a book very helpful called Reframe Your Story, Real Talk for Women Who Want to Let Go, Do Less, and Be More. And so that's written with Canadian Tammy Herman, and that had shifted her thinking. So that raises another question for me, which is a very famous book in this general space is Lean In. And so how do your findings and perhaps your own perspective as influenced by your research findings, how does that jive with the Lean In message?
So let me tell you my story of reading Lean In. So Lean In, I came across it first when it was published. At the time, I didn't do any research on gender inequalities. And I mean, most of my training is in economics up until that point. Now, in economics, a lot of the models that we use to think about the world just ignores gender. You know, like, we're all neutral, we're all agentic, and we can do whatever we want to do. It's kind of very nice, but also very much not descriptive, you know? And so at the time when I read it in 2013, I was like, yeah, it makes sense. And then I started to do my research on gender inequalities. And so I went back to it when I was actually writing this study. And I was like, I seem to remember that it's really in the woman's court to get over all the problems. Like, lean in harder, and if it doesn't work, you just lean in some more. Like, you reprogram your microwave to the second, you know. She has an example about that. And yeah, so I went back and reread it, and I was really shocked by how much there was just a discussion of how women need to work harder and work with everything they have, and how there wasn't a discussion of the structures that we're living in, the cultural norms, the ways in which organizations have really historically been organized about the ideal worker being a man. And so we think of organizations as these neutral structures. And I think that in itself is problematic. Organizations have historically been built by men for men. I mean, there were times when there were no bathrooms for women in organizations because there were no women working there. And so this is where we're coming from. And also the hierarchy is very much like in the military, because again, this is the history of how organizations were built. So I would challenge the perspective that organizations are inherently neutral and all you need to do is lean in. I would invite people to question that and think about how organizations are perhaps gendered, in the sense that they're built with a particular ideal of a worker. And that ideal is somebody who is a man and who also is a very particular kind of man. I want to emphasize that. I don't want to put all the men in one bucket and say it's their fault. It's not. Okay, so it's a particular kind of man who doesn't take on any care work and who's not interested in that. And we know lots of men who aren't like that. So it's also very problematic, therefore, for men, because many men don't fit into the bucket of the ideal worker. So the ideal work is really very, very, very restrictive idea of a person.
And Crystal has shared that her husband was the first person in his company to take parental leave after it became legal, and he was told not to come back because it set a bad precedent.
Well,
that example.
I'm shocked but not surprised. You know, that's terrible.
And so you're right about the Homo economicus, which is this ideal, this notion of the human being just being this optimizing, gender neutral agent in the world, and clearly that doesn't correspond with most of our experiences in life and within organizations. So I'm thinking of this now from the perspective of a senior leader of any gender identity, whether it be a board member or an executive. I'm charged with getting the most out of my organization. If it's a not-for-profit, well, then they're non-financial goals. If it's a for-profit entity, then it's to maximize shareholder wealth, perhaps with sustainability in mind, depending upon what your values in charge are. But the main point is I'm charged with getting the most out of this organization, and organizations are full of people. Why would I not want to understand this and implement organizational changes in order to get the most out of whatever I have available to work with? So I'm imagining the planet being full of would-be workers, and there's a distribution, and I believe that talent is evenly distributed across races, sexual orientations, religions, genders, gender identities, etc. And so if you have an organization of 1,000 people, then the top 10% of your workers, they could be white collar, blue collar, whatever, but the top 10% of your workforce should be 50 women, 50 men, because talents are evenly distributed. And so, and if it's not that, let's say you have 80 men and 20 women, then statistically speaking, at least, you may have 30 men who don't belong in there, and you're missing 30 women who are. So you're not getting the best talent into these roles. So why would you not want that? And why would you not try to implement everything you can to get there? For me, it's not about quotas. It's about saying, identify the talent. It is there.
Of course. Well, I think there can be multiple reasons. So I think one big reason is that there are people who are just not seeing it. Like, they didn't grow up in a body that is not the norm in an organization. They grew up with a body that is the norm. They don't necessarily have the experience of operating at the margin of whatever is the definition of an ideal worker. If you look at certain industries in Canada, they're very masculine industries, oil and gas. So there it's considered normal that it's all guys. And so if this is kind of the water you're swimming in as a fish, you don't see it. And you might not even be in bad faith, but for you, this is normal. And you might also have grown up with the norm, with the sort of norm that women should be looking after kids. And you're not questioning that. You're not questioning that in terms of talent, because you think there's plenty men to go around. And so what would you need women for? So that can be one explanation. Another explanation that I've had women point out to me is that there's a very open resistance to just opening the gates to leadership, that as a man, if half of the population is excluded from leadership, it makes it easier for me to be in there. I will have less competition. So it's a form of resistance. I don't want to give up my board seat. There are no term limits for board seats in Canada. So I don't want to give it up, and I want to hang on as long as possible. If now we open the floodgates to having more women in leadership, well, then there might be somebody better than me, and I don't want that. So that's another reason. Yet another reason might be that, well, there's something called homosociability. People of a certain gender like to hang out with each other because you have similar shared experiences, just because you have the same body parts, And so men like to hang out with men, and oftentimes it is difficult for women to hang out with men, also because we have issues like sexual harassment and sexual abuse. And so at the time when I did my interviews in 2017, which is when Me Too happened, a lot of leaders opened up about that. And so if women are worried about that, well, they're going to be worried about going into bars. And I've also heard stories about, meetings being in strip clubs. Yeah, so, not cool. So then, of course, you don't necessarily have women who are willing to go there. Again, I don't want to say that all men do this. I think a very much lighter version is, not everybody plays golf. And golf seems to be the sport that's being played in leadership. And I remember I had one woman told me that, well, she wasn't even sent the invitation because she's a woman, and she actually happened to be a golf player. So that was actually the funny part, but she wasn't asked because people presumed she didn't play golf because she's a woman. So there's all these presumptions, there's all these gendered activities, and that make it really hard. So yeah, there's not one answer to your question. There's multiple answers of why this happens.
And so Samir has asked, and I can confirm, having worked under his presidency at the CAAA, that he's done an awful lot to be sensitive to these issues and promote diversity of all kinds in our organization. What are some pragmatic steps that we can take to fix the problem in a consequential and sustainable way?
Mm-hmm.
And especially to avoid social washing, which you alluded to earlier with the...
I think it's important to speak to people and listen to them. So if in your organization you're concerned about this, find a way to talk to people without making them worried about their careers, you know, like listen to experiences. By all means, if you have people leaving your company, have exit interviews. Like you understand why your people are leaving. You want to look at your company, and yes, numbers can be helpful. Like look at what stage is it that you're losing people and why. You need to really understand that. So the numbers can give you an idea, but they don't tell you the whole story. You need to go out and talk to people who leave, but also people who stay, and what is it that they experience, and take that seriously. I think oftentimes leaders don't necessarily take this seriously because they think they know better. I mean, leaders, I think by definition, they're very confident, they think they know everything, and they forget that, well, their experience isn't everybody's experience. So it's important to go and speak to people. And I think that's something very pragmatic that you can do. You can do an anonymous survey across people. If you have people that can establish relationships of trust and where there can be a one-on-one conversation, that's even better. But I think there's ways to understand how it is that some people have difficult experiences and what's the organization's role in that.
Sorry, Samir has a second related question. What are the key systemic barriers to holding our women colleagues back from leadership roles in accounting and finance? And do current corporate diversity initiatives risk being more performative than transformational in addressing these challenges?
So I think the big issue that we're still facing is the issue of care work being largely seen as women's work. So I think that's something that we need to see, that we need to change. If we look at maternity, paternity leaves in Canada, they're still much more taken by women than by men. And that's a huge problem. And no, this isn't just me who says it. This is Claudia Goldin, who got the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2023, and I'm citing her here. She says, the last mile, the last chapter, the final act in the gender gap saga cannot be written until couples share more and until the world of work makes that a less costly thing to do. So I think that's it. That's the big thing.
That's the big starting point. And one of the things that you mentioned was to speak to people, but you also said listen to them. And so my experience is there's also some washing going on in the saying that, oh yeah, well, we had this discussion, but there are leaders who don't seem to be listening to it because it's difficult for them to hear what is being said, maybe because they don't want it to be true, or they don't have a solution. I don't know why, but the listening part and then responding to that and not just being seen to have the conversation seems to be a missing link that I've observed as well. And so
I think, you know, Liz, when I think about that, what is important in there is having accountability. So if you look at traditional organizations, you have the C-suite and then you have the board. And, you know, why not having the board have some sort of structure where they can communicate with employees, where, you know, there is some of that feedback that actually sidestep the C-suite if there are problems of, you know, people moving upwards. I think more knowledge is better in these situations.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, is to skip that level. If there's a bottleneck at that level, to skip over it. And so let's see if there are no further questions coming. I can open it up to a Q&A if anybody wants to come on and ask a question. I'll leave it open there for a few minutes. You can raise your hand and we can unmic you or unmute you. Or in the closing moments, Claudine, perhaps what would you like to leave us with in terms of closing thoughts, comments, recommendations, reasons for hope, or calls to action for us if we're women or identify as women, and for our colleagues who would like to be allies in this?
Yeah, so I think this notion of having allies is actually really important. And you know, I'm happy to see there are so many people here on the call that I'm sure are sensitive to this issue. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here. And I think there is strength in numbers. So you know, like we were talking about numbers and how numbers can be counterproductive. But you know, if there's enough people demanding change, it is going to happen. And I think this needs to happen in the area of care work. So when it comes to our allies, be that women or men, try, like if you're a man leader, try and, you know, make sure that the ways in which you enact leadership is inclusive and doesn't define leadership in very traditional sort of assertive ways that will exclude people from that leadership. And by all means, you know, talk about your care work that you're doing, you know, and support people in your organization that want to do care work. It's extremely expensive for an organization to lose somebody who doesn't come back, who leaves work to take care of their family full time, and then have to rehire somebody, retrain a person. So because with every person who leaves or who goes and looks for another job in an organization that is more inclusive, for every person that leaves, you know, you have to retrain somebody, and you have a lot of institutional knowledge that is being lost, and you can't get that back right away with somebody new. So I think it is very important to be aware of that, and to sort of try and be a role model. If you're a woman, like be a role model, and you know, also, you know, speak up if you can afford to speak up. I know this isn't always possible depending on where you are in the hierarchy. But if you can afford to speak up if you see behavior that isn't appropriate, you know, if you see somebody being called the itch label, you know, I think it's important, because by not speaking up, we're also saying it's okay. So if we do have sort of the capital, the cultural capital or the social capital in an organization to speak up, we should do that, you know.
And so this is recollects something that we had in an earlier conversation, which was the role of the bystander in this. And maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this bystander idea.
So the notion of the bystander, there's in research on violence, there is an important role for bystanders. So when somebody is, for instance, assaulted in a metro station, oftentimes the more people you have and nobody speaks up, the less likely it is that somebody will speak up, even though you have a whole crowd around, you know. So it's important for one person to step forward and speak up and say something, and oftentimes that will trigger other people to also speak up. And the bystander can make a big difference in the experience of the victim, and in fact stop whatever is about to happen. Now, of course, you also need to make sure you're safe as a bystander. So that's why I'm saying, depending on where you are in the hierarchy, you might feel more or less safe to speak up. But because of you as a bystander, if you speak up, you can have an effect on the behavior that isn't healthy, that should be stopped. To say, first of all, it's wrong and we shouldn't do that. And second of all, it's also good to speak up about that and not consider that this is normal. It's not.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Claudine, for sharing your insights on all of this. I hope it leads to progress, and I know that I'll definitely be following your future work in this area. And of course, I invite everyone on the call to check out your work in this area as well. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Liz, for having me. It was a really fun conversation, and yeah. I hope things will change. You know, I'll try and do my part.
And you're doing so. Thanks again. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.